The aircraft of the future broke down before it ever had the chance to become a legend. November 1943. California. The secret Muroc Army airfield. Onto the concrete they roll out a dark green machine with no propeller. This is the first experimental F-80, the future American shooting star, the aircraft that was to open the door to the jet age for the United States. They built it in a frantic race, in 142 days, an almost impossible deadline even for wartime. Around the machine stand engineers, technicians, military men. Everyone awaits the historic moment. But one British specialist looks not at the overall silhouette, but at the air intakes. The metal seems too thin to him, too weak for the force about to be awakened inside the fuselage. He tries to warn them, but on the day of a great triumph, warnings sound too quietly. The engine is started. First, a low alien hum. Then, the rising whistle of the turbine. Not the roar of pistons. Not the rattle of propeller-driven aviation. This is the sound of a new era. The engine is brought to takeoff power, and then the new era is torn to pieces. The intake ducts do not hold. They are ripped from their mountings and sucked into the turbine. A metallic screech strikes across the runway. Steel tears against steel. The engine chokes. Debris, dust, smoke. A few seconds later, silence again. The first American jet fighter begins its biography not with a victorious takeoff, but with an accident that could almost have been predicted. So who was the shooting star, really? A great breakthrough? A raw machine sent into the sky too soon? Or an inevitable victim of an era when aviation leaped into the future faster than it had learned to survive? Today we will take this legend apart without the gilding. From Muroc to Korea, from a record-breaking development to the encounter with the MiG-15. A falling star. Is it a symbol of luck? Or is it, after all, that which burns up before ever reaching the ground? We begin. The year 1938. The world does not yet know it stands at the very edge of the abyss. A little more than a year remains before the first shots of the Great War. But in the quiet drafting offices of the Lockheed Company, the future is already being drawn. And that future looks fantastical. Picture a sheet of drawing paper on a tilted board. A man bends over it. The pencil in his hand moves with confidence, almost with fury. On the paper emerge the contours of a machine that does not yet exist in nature. An interceptor, but not like all the others. Not another piston biplane with a rattling motor and wooden spars. No, this is something else. Something that does not yet even have a precise name. The figures written beside it seem like the ravings of a madman. Weight, 9 tons. Speed, 1,000 kilometers per hour. 1,000. At a time when the best production fighters in the world barely cleared 500, and 550 was considered an outstanding achievement, that number sounded like a mockery of the laws of physics, like a promise simply impossible to keep. A magic mark. A threshold aviation had been approaching slowly, 10 or 20 kilometers a year, winning them with sweat and blood. And here, 1,000 at once, on paper. This relates to that special breed of people who do not know how to dream small. The man at the board was named Clarence Johnson, but in the history of aviation, he is remembered by another name, Kelly, just Kelly, and that was enough. Say those 2 syllables in any design bureau on either side of the ocean, and people will nod in understanding. Because Kelly Johnson was not merely an engineer, he was a phenomenon, an organizational genius, a man who could do the impossible within deadlines that ordinary people couldn't meet even with the possible. Legends circled him while he still lived. They said he could glance at a blueprint and sniff out, quite literally by instinct, an error that dozens of certified specialists had missed. They said he could assemble a team out of nothing and make it move mountains. That for him the word impossible did not exist. There was only, We haven't figured out how yet." And it was to him that the company entrusted this mad, ahead-of-its-time project. A super-fast interceptor that was to not merely catch up with the future, but seize it by the throat. 3 years. A full 3 years Lockheed on its own initiative, meaning at its own risk, without a government contract, without guarantees, on its own money, bit into this problem. And these were not years of empty talk. In that time, the principal materials were settled, the configuration was chosen. Scale models were tested in the wind tunnel, watching how the airflows behaved around those predatory contours. Painstakingly, step by step, the dream took on engineering flesh. Calculations, blueprints, tests, calculations again. The machine on paper was nearly ready. It breathed. It begged for the sky. It seemed that to embody this marvel in metal, only one thing was missing. Just one. But it was precisely that one thing that was the stumbling block, the engine. This relates to the very core of our story today. Do you understand the devilish irony? You could draw the perfect airframe. You could calculate flawless aerodynamics. You could select the finest alloys. But without a heart, without a reliable and sufficiently powerful power plant, all of it remained a pretty picture. A pile of dead metal incapable of tearing itself from the ground. And it was precisely a heart that the machine did not have. The turbojet engine, that very technology that promised to wrench aviation out of the age of propellers and hurl it into the jet century, in the late 30s existed in the United States only in embryonic form. It essentially did not exist. Not a single working, refined example capable of lifting a combat fighter into the sky. The dream, weighing 9 tons, ran up against a void exactly where its heart should have been beating. And then, the world collapsed. The Second World War did not come all at once, but when the country was drawn into that maelstrom, everything changed in an instant. There was no time for fantasy, no time for interceptors from the future. The Army needed aircraft here and now, thousands of aircraft, proven, understood, ready for mass production piston machines that could be riveted out on a conveyor and thrown into battle. And Lockheed's leadership made the only sensible decision in that situation. A hard one, but the only sensible one. The project was shut down. All the strength, all the minds, all the resources were redirected toward improving and ramping up the output of existing equipment. The blueprints of the super-fast interceptor went into the back drawer. Kelly Johnson's dream fell asleep, folded away, set aside, almost forgotten in the fever of the wartime rush. And who knows how long it would have lain there, in the dust of the archives, were it not for one event. The spring of 1943. Under the Lend-Lease program, that very system of military supply between allies, a package arrives in the United States from foggy Albion, from Britain. And in that package, not tanks, not cartridges, not canned stew. In it, something far more valuable for our story, a turbojet engine, British, with an almost fairy tale name, the de Havilland Goblin. Goblin, a small, wicked spirit out of English folklore, and this spirit in metal arrives across the ocean and changes everything. Because Britain, like Germany, had pulled ahead in the race of jet engines. While American designers struggled with theory, on the other side of the channel pre-production examples of jet aircraft already existed, real ones, flying, and the thrust of this very Goblin was enough, more than enough, to lift a full-fledged combat fighter into the sky. The very heart so fatally missing from Kelly Johnson's dream had finally appeared. Borrowed, yes. Imported, yes. But beating. And then the shelved project was remembered, sharply, urgently, with that particular nervousness that grips people who have realized they are running late. And the Americans were running late, badly. Germany and Great Britain were already breathing the jet future. They had finished machines. The United States, a world industrial power, a giant capable of burying the enemy under steel and aluminum, in this particular race was lagging at the tail. And this situation had to be fixed, immediately. This is where what the first phase of our investigation was actually launched for begins. The blueprint turns into a race. To close the gap, the military allotted a laughable, mockingly short deadline, half a year, 6 months, at the end of which Lockheed was obligated to hand over finished prototypes for testing, not sketches, not models, living, breathing machines of metal ready to take to the air. Think about that. To build from scratch a super-fast jet interceptor, a machine of a fundamentally new type that no one in the country had yet made, in half a year, a task on the edge of madness, a task that would make any sane engineer throw up his hands. Any, but not Kelly Johnson. This relates to exactly how the true legends of industry are born. He did not panic. He did what he did better than anyone in the world. He assembled a team. Out of 28 engineers and about 100 workers, he immediately formed an autonomous group. The word autonomous here is the key. This group lived by its own laws. At its disposal, by a single telephone call, any necessary resources were handed over, without bureaucracy, without the months-long approvals and paper shuffling that usually strangle any great undertaking. Need a part? A call. Need people? A call. Need a machine tool? A call. And everything appeared, instantly. Thus was born what would later be called one of the most famous design collectives in the history of world aviation. But at that moment, it was simply a handful of obsessed people locked in a race against time. And now picture their daily life, their everyday existence across those 180 days. To wring out precious time, to not lose a single minute on the commute, the men effectively moved into their workplaces. They lived there, in the shop, at the lathes, at the drafting boards. They slept in snatches, ate on the move. 14 hours a day, every day, no weekends, no respite, they gave to this machine. 14 hours of the most intense mental and physical labor, day after day, week after week. The air in that hangar must have been thick with the smell of metal shavings, machine oil, tobacco smoke, and coffee. Tools clanged, machines hummed. The tracing paper of blueprints rustled. Someone argued at the board until they were hoarse. Someone, dropping their head onto their hands, sank into a short, anxious sleep right at the workbench, only to jump up an hour later and take up the work again. Faces grew gaunt, eyes reddened from lack of sleep and the bright light of the lamps. But in those eyes, a fire burned. The fire of people who know. They are making history, and all of it, under a veil of the strictest secrecy. What exactly was being built in the heavily guarded hangar was known to only an extremely narrow circle of people. The secrecy was total, no entry for outsiders. Ask no extra questions. The machine was born in the shadows, hidden from prying eyes, as befits a weapon capable of changing the balance of forces in the sky. And here is what astonishes most of all. Despite the insane deadline, despite the inhuman exhaustion, despite the colossal complexity of the task, the work was progressing not merely on schedule. It was running ahead of it. Ahead of it, friends. Think about that. Where any other collective would have fallen behind by months, Kelly Johnson's group was outpacing its own, already unthinkable, plan. It was like a miracle. Like a triumph of human will and engineering genius over inert reality. Thus, on paper and in metal, a dream was being born, swiftly, furiously, in defiance of everything. But it was precisely here, at this ascent, in this intoxicating sense of an approaching triumph, that the first trap lay hidden. Because a race to get ahead has its price. Haste has its price. And that very thin metal of the air intakes that we saw at the very start of our investigation, it did not arise from nowhere. It was the direct consequence of this frantic race. Of these 142 days, the blueprint was nearly ready to turn into iron. The dream was ready to touch the concrete. And here begins the next phase, the taxi run, where beautiful theory will meet merciless practice for the first time, and where the machine will first reveal its hidden, deadly temper. 142 days. Remember that number, friends. Not the 180 allotted by the contract, not half a year, 142 days. 38 days faster than an unthinkable deadline. That is exactly how long it took the obsessed men of Kelly Johnson's autonomous group to turn pencil lines on drawing paper into living, breathing iron. The prototype was ready. It stood in the dim light of the hangar, and you wanted to look at it without ever tearing your eyes away. Picture that moment. The gates swing open. Daylight bursts inside and snatches out of the shadows a silhouette no one here had ever seen before. An all-metal low-wing monoplane, a smooth, streamlined body without a single superfluous detail, metal polished to a cold gleam, and silence where a motor should have roared. No propeller, no exhaust stacks along the sides, an emptiness in the nose that, to an eye accustomed to piston machines, seemed almost unnatural. This relates to that rare sensation of seeing an object from the future cast into the past. For the sake of manufacturability, and therefore the speed of construction, Johnson resorted to a trick. He brought his jet firstborn as close as possible to the familiar piston brethren. No revolutionary, risky solutions in the airframe. A straight wing, simple, understood, proven. A single-fin tail of classic design. All the things engineers knew how to calculate and build without spending precious weeks on experiments. The revolution hid inside, in the engine, and on the outside, the machine remained almost conservative. Almost. But something gave it away as a guest from another era. The teardrop canopy, a smooth, transparent dome, like a drop of water frozen on the metal. It gave the pilot a field of view never seen before. And the tricycle landing gear with a nose wheel, also a mark of new times, for most piston machines of that day still rested their tails on a little wheel near the ground. And here, a proud strut beneath the nose, lifting the body level, horizontal, ready for a swift takeoff run. And now, the main trump card of the design, the very one that hid in the empty nose. The engine, you see, was located at the rear, in the back of the fuselage, and this freed up precious space in the nose of the machine. Space the engineers filled with teeth, an imposing battery of 5 barrels, caliber 12.7 millimeters, 5 heavy machine guns gathered into a single fist. One salvo from such a battery would punch an enemy machine clean through. The Predator had been given fangs, and those fangs were truly terrifying. The machine was inspected, admired, and then immediately taken apart again. In crates stamped top secret, the precious cargo was transported to the Air Force test range, Muroc Army Airfield, lost in the California desert. There, where a runway awaited it, and where history had already lifted its pen to write the first tragic line. Early morning, the very one with which we began our investigation. The fighter, painted dark green, is rolled out onto the concrete. The air trembles with tension. The designers, who haven't truly slept in weeks, prepare to see the fruit of their mad labor in action. And here a man appears whose name history, alas, has scarcely preserved. A representative of the British engine manufacturer, the very one that sent the Goblin engine across the ocean. He stands a little off to the side. He looks at the machine with a professional, sharp eye, and he sees what the others, in the fever of triumph, fail to notice. The air intakes. This relates to the very heart of our story today, to the turn after which everything went wrong. The Briton shakes his head. The metal from which the inlet ducts are made is, in his opinion, too thin, too flimsy. Do you understand the issue? A turbojet engine is, in essence, a giant pump. As it spins up, it sucks air into itself with monstrous force, tons of air every second, and the walls of the ducts that carry this air to the turbine must withstand a colossal vacuum, a terrible pressure differential. And it seems to the experienced engineer from foggy Albion that in the chase for speed, for those very 142 days, the Americans had skimped where skimping was not allowed, made the metal too thin. He tries to convey this. He warns them. But who will listen to an outsider on a day like this? The designers are consumed by preparations for the historic flight. Their names are about to enter the textbooks. Their dream is about to soar into the sky. The Briton's warning drowns in the general hum. It dissolves. They listen to him politely and let it pass by their ears. They pay it no heed. And yet it was the voice of reason, the single sober voice among people intoxicated by triumph. And the hubris was punished immediately. The second engine is brought to takeoff power. The turbine spins up to its limit, and its appetite becomes insatiable. It demands more air, more. And the thin metal does not hold. Both inlet ducts are torn from their mountings and sucked straight into the running turbine. The sound of that disaster is impossible to forget. The clang, the screech of rending steel against blades spinning at furious revolutions, the wail of a choking engine gagging on its own innards, and then a sharp, muffled silence, and in that silence, frozen faces. That Briton says nothing. It is bitter for him. He turned out to be right, but in that rightness there is not a drop of joy. The damage assessment is merciless. The power plant is beyond repair. The engine is dead, and here the full depth of the problem is laid bare, friends. The full price of that very haste. There is nothing to replace the engine with. Do you understand? On the entire territory of the United States, a world industrial power, there was, at that moment, not a single other working example of a turbojet engine. Not one. That Goblin was, in essence, a unique specimen. And now it lay as a heap of mangled metal. A new engine had to be awaited. From where? From foggy Albion again, across an ocean teeming with German submarines. And that wait stretched out to 2 whole months. 2 months of standstill. 2 months thrown to the dogs. All the lead. All the 38 days won by inhuman labor. All of it burned up in that wrecked turbine. The race to get ahead, in a single instant, turned into a race from behind, and the cause of it, an ignored warning, thin metal, and haste. But Johnson's men did not give up. They waited it out. A new Goblin arrived, was installed, every rivet checked, and at last came the day for which all of it had been undertaken. January 8th, 1944. The machine, now bearing its own name, resonant and beautiful, shooting star, a falling star, taxis out onto the runway. The test pilot is in the teardrop canopy. The engine comes up to power, this time evenly, confidently, with that very rising whistle. The takeoff run, the liftoff, and the green arrow tears away from the California concrete for the first time and goes into the sky. This relates to one of the most beautiful pages in the history of aviation. The flight went successfully, more than successfully. The prototype demonstrated excellent stability, predictable, obedient handling. The machine obeyed the pilot like a well-broken horse, and already in one of the first flights, the national speed record was renewed. The Shooting Star became the first American aircraft to break the 800 km/h mark in level flight. 800. That very magic 1,000 that had once seemed like raving was now not far off. The dream of 1938 had come alive. It was flying. It was setting records. It would seem, here it is, the triumph, the happy ending. The genius has won, the perseverance rewarded, the machine beautiful. But do not rush to rejoice, friends, because the protocol of our investigation demands impartiality. And behind the gleam of the records, a shadow already lurked. That very splinter that would lodge deep and ache for long years, the power plant, the heart of the machine. It was capricious, constantly, from the very beginning. What happened on the ground with the torn-off air intakes turned out to be no absurd accident, no one-time glitch. It was merely the first symptom, the first warning bell of that chronic illness that would haunt the shooting star throughout its entire career. The engine, that very marvel that gave the machine its wings, was at the same time its Achilles heel. It was complex, it was temperamental, it was unreliable, and instead of becoming a faithful heart, it threatened, time and again, to become the cause of death. The machine flew beautifully, the machine broke records, but in its chest beat a heart that could not be trusted, and this contradiction between the gleaming visage of a record breaker and the capricious, dangerous insides would determine the entire further fate of the aircraft. It would run like a thread through all our coming phases. It would cost machines. It would cost nerves. And, as we shall soon see, it would cost lives. The blueprint became iron. The iron rose into the sky, but the hidden flaw was already sewn into its design for good, there, in the rear of the fuselage, where the temperamental turbine spun up. And in the next phase of our investigation, the flutter, this flaw will step out of the shadows. It will begin to gather its terrible harvest, and we will see what price had to be paid for the beauty of a falling star. The capricious British heart had to be replaced. That became clear fairly quickly. The Alice Chalmers firm, entrusted with the licensed production of the Goblin on American soil, simply could not master its too intricate alien design. The first batches of engines were distinguished by extreme, monstrous failure rates. They broke down, they stalled, they quit. And Lockheed's leadership, gritting their teeth, set off once more in search, to find a new heart for their falling star. And, surprisingly, they found one. And not across the ocean, not among the haughty British, but at home. In the winter of 1944, the General Electric Company reported the completion of work on a deeply modernized jet engine. At its core lay that same design by the Briton Frank Whittle, the father of jet aviation, but reconceived, reworked, refined by American engineers. The engine bore the name I-40, and, without losing a single minute, its first examples were immediately installed on a pair of pre-production fighters. This relates to how one problem, in being solved, immediately gives birth to another, because the new heart turned out to be larger, heavier, hungrier than its predecessor, and it could not be squeezed into the old airframe. They had to rework practically the entire fuselage, to widen it, lengthen it, strengthen it, to recut the machine to fit its new master, a colossal labor. But, as the subsequent tests showed, it was worth it. The reworked shooting star, now with an A suffix in its designation, came out onto the measured course. The pilot gave full throttle, and the machine surged forward in a way that took the breath away. The speedometer needle crept to the right, toward unthinkable marks. 800, 850, and a fantastical 890 kilometers per hour. 890. That very magic thousand from the dream of 1938 was now within arm's reach. The machine flew as never before. It was beautiful. It was swift. It was the pinnacle of American engineering thought. And now, the uncomfortable truth, friends, the very one for the sake of which we are conducting our investigation. As for reliability, almost nothing changed. The new heart beat just as unevenly as the old one. It just as readily threatened to stop at any moment. And the figures here speak more terribly than any words. Over the course of the following 8 months, both of those very test aircraft that had accelerated to record speeds would perish, both, due to power plant failures. Think about that. The machine breaks records and immediately kills itself. It posts a fantastical 890 and a few months later lies as a heap of wreckage because of a stalled engine. Triumph and catastrophe went hand in hand. They sat in the same cockpit. And this was only a small, the very first part of that terrible price the Air Force was still to pay for the desire to get its hands on jet equipment as quickly as possible. In parallel with these tests, serial production was already unfolding. Machines came off the stocks, were painted, armed, and sent to combat units. And here is where our story ceases to be a tale of iron. Here a human enters it. A living pilot of flesh and blood who would have to master the temperamental novelty. And this human treated the propellerless Hawk with a considerable measure of distrust. This relates to the most dramatic human side of our investigation. Picture yourself in such a pilot's place. Your whole flying life you spent behind a spinning propeller. That propeller before your eyes, it is like a part of you. And now it is gone. Emptiness. Unfamiliar, unsettling. The landing gear is arranged somehow strangely, in a new way, with a nose strut, and on the ground the machine sits level, not with its tail up the way you're used to. To this too you must adapt, retrain your hands and feet. But the hardest trial turned out to be something else, the silence. In a piston aircraft, the pilot literally listened to his engine. The hum of the motor was a living language in which the machine spoke to the pilot. By the slightest change in tone, by a tremor, by a stutter in the roar of the motor, an experienced pilot understood, without a single glance at the instruments, what was happening with the power plant. The motor was his interlocutor, his second self, and now, silence. An oppressive, unnatural silence in the cockpit. The turbine behind his back worked almost noiselessly, robbing the pilot of this most important source of information. And what was left for the pilot to do? Only one thing: to never take his eyes off the instrument panel, off a whole scattering of needles, dials, indicators, each of which had to be watched continuously. Revolutions, temperature, pressure, fuel, dozens of parameters. Earlier, the motor itself had told of these. Now, only cold needles, and the moment you got distracted, lost track of one of them, disaster. This sharply, many-fold complicated the flying, especially in the most dangerous regimes, at takeoff and landing, when seconds count, when there is no right to a mistake. The pilot was overloaded, buried in information he had once received by intuition, and the number of accidents grew steadily, terribly. And now, friends, I will tell you a story that makes you go cold inside. A story of how this hidden flaw claimed perhaps its loudest victim. His name was Major Richard Bong, and this was no ordinary pilot. This was the most successful ace of the United States Air Force in all its history, the best of the best. A man who had passed through the fire of the fiercest aerial battles over the Pacific, who had shot down dozens of enemy machines. A sky hunter whose skill had been honed to a razor's edge. It seemed nothing could destroy such a pilot. And this very man sits in the cockpit of a shooting star. Takeoff. The most ordinary, routine takeoff. And the most experienced ace, a master with thousands of hours logged, fails to flip one single switch. The fuel pump switch, a little toggle in that very overloaded instrument panel where it was so easy to miss something in the oppressive silence of the new machine. The engine, deprived of fuel, stalls at the very moment of takeoff, at the moment when there is no right to a mistake. America's best ace perished, not in battle with a superior opponent, not under the fire of enemy flak, but because of one unflipped switch, because of that very trap that lurked in the temperamental heart and the unfamiliar cockpit of the falling star. Bong's death thundered across the whole country. Trust in the new machine, already shaky, was shaken still more, and Lockheed understood. Something had to be done. Urgently. Otherwise, the reputation could no longer be saved. The company made a desperate but beautiful move. It organized a demonstration tour. 3 specially selected machines, 3 exemplary shooting stars, were to fly 500 hours each without a single accident. 500 hours of ideal, flawless operation in full view of everyone, to prove to combat pilots, to the military, to the whole country, the machine can be trusted. And, credit where it's due, the tour succeeded. The 3 exemplars flew out their term without a single incident. The shaken trust was at least partly restored. But ahead lay one more moment of truth. A sobering one, and, perhaps, the most uncomfortable for American pride. After the war, a rarest of opportunities appeared to compare the shooting star head-to-head with the best, most refined jet fighter of the vanquished enemy, the German Messerschmitt 262 Schwalbe, that is, Swallow. That very machine that was the first in the world to go into production and actually fought in the skies over Europe. 2 firstborns of the jet era met in a fair comparison, and the result made very many people stop and think. According to the pilots who sat in both cockpits, the German machine, note, a model from as far back as 1944, a machine of the losing side, with a knowingly greater weight, possessed a comparable rate of climb, and in acceleration characteristics it outright surpassed the American aircraft. The German, defeated, lying in ruins, had in some respects done it better than the triumphant victor, and the Swallow had yet another indisputable advantage. Something the shooting star did not have at all: an ejection seat, a device capable, in case of trouble, of literally shooting the pilot out of a dying machine, of saving his life. On the capricious American fighter, where the engines failed with frightening regularity, no such salvation for the pilot had been provided. The man was locked in the cockpit, alone with his temperamental heart, and Lockheed's specialists acted in the only sensible way. They copied it. They studied the German ejection seat, took it apart down to the last screw, and introduced this life-saving device into their own machine, in a modification that appeared later. The victors learned from the vanquished. This is a bitter but honest page of our investigation. There it is, the flutter phase in its full extent, a destructive vibration that built unnoticed beneath the gleaming skin of the record breaker. The machine flew ever faster. It set ever new records. But beneath this shining shell hid a temperamental, unreliable motor, an overloaded cockpit trap, and the bitter truth that the vanquished enemy had, in some respects, been better. Every record was paid for with shattered aircraft. Every triumph stood beside a funeral. The falling star shone ever brighter, but it also burned up ever more swiftly. And yet, despite all these flaws, all this terrible price, the machine was being refined, polished, strengthened, prepared for what it had been created for a real war, and that war was already not far off. In the next phase of our investigation, the combat turn, the falling star will at last enter the zone of fire, and we will see what it was worth in real and not demonstration battle. Toward the end of its road, the falling star had at last come of age. From a temperamental, capricious adolescent, it had turned into a mature fighter. The final version received a strengthened airframe, sturdier, tougher, capable of bearing the loads of a real war. Beneath the wings appeared mounts for 10 unguided rockets. The machine acquired not only fangs in its nose, but claws beneath its planes. Now it was no longer merely a record breaker. It was a predator, ready for the hunt. And this predator drew the interest not only of the customer in the uniform of the land-based Air Force. The Navy set its eye seriously on the shooting star, at that time desperately needing jet equipment and suffering an acute shortage of it. The machine was in high demand. Thanks to a whole series of additional agreements, production of the Falling Star continued year after year without stopping, and the pinnacle of this production was the model with the letter C, the most numerous, the largest production run in the entire history of the aircraft. More than 1,000 such fighters came off the stocks and scattered across fighter squadrons spread all over the world, from Europe to the Pacific. The Falling Star was no longer a prototype trembling on the test strip. It had become the workhorse of a mighty air force. This relates to that rare moment when a machine at last finds its place in the ranks, and that place turned out to be very close to a new war. Just before the start of hostilities on the Korean peninsula, an imposing force was concentrated at the airfields of neighboring Japan, a strike group of 300 aircraft of this type, 300 Falling Stars, lined up in a row on the concrete strips, with full tanks, loaded guns, a jet fist ready to crash down upon the enemy's head, and the command's plan was simple and bold. By their calculations, this jet steamroller was simply to roll over the small and obsolete piston aviation of the Northerners, to crush it with a single blow, to clear the sky. An easy stroll for the pilots of the jet machines, so it seemed on paper, and at first, everything went exactly that way. On June 27, 1950, the Shooting Stars opened their combat account. A foursome of American jets patrolled the sky not far from Kimpo Airfield, and suddenly, beneath the wing, 2 flights. North Korean Il-10 attack planes, piston-engined, sluggish, unaware of the looming threat. What happened next took mere minutes. The jet machines fell upon the enemy from above, using their monstrous advantage in speed. Bursts of heavy machine guns ripped through the skin of the piston attack planes. Without a single loss on their own side, the Americans shot down 4 enemy machines, 4-0, a flawless, crushing score. The zone of fire received the Falling Star favorably, and then more. The North Korean fighters, too, could put up little against the jets. The old piston yaks and Lavochkins, honored veterans of the last war, were doomed. The Shooting Star pilots did not engage in maneuvering, turning combat, where a piston machine still had a chance. No, they used their main trump card, speed. They swooped in, gunned them down, climbed away, out of reach. Swooped in again. This was not a duel. It was a hunt. By mid-July, the count of downed enemy machines was already running into the 100. 100 enemy aircraft. The sky over Korea was emptying rapidly. The jet steamroller had worked exactly as conceived. The aerial targets ran dry. There was simply no one left to shoot down. And then the Falling Star was reoriented. Since no enemy was left in the sky, go down to the ground. Support your own troops. The Shooting Stars were switched to close support of the ground units. But here an unpleasant truth came to light, friends. The very one without which our investigation would be incomplete. The heavy machine guns and unguided rockets in which the machine took such pride turned out to be nearly useless against the Northerners' tank columns. The bullets bounced off the armor. The rockets fell wide. The jet fighter, honed for aerial combat, was poorly suited to the role of tank killer. The solution found was simple and terrible. Napalm. Ever more jets went on missions carrying not rockets on their underwing pylons, but tanks of this fiery mixture. And here, in the role of an attack plane, the Falling Star truly came into its own. It must be admitted honestly, despite the complete absence of armor, despite its extreme vulnerability to fire from the ground, in these first months of the war, the machine turned out to be an exceptionally useful and effective weapon. In certain periods, up to 70% of the total number of all combat sorties fell to its share. 70%. The Falling Star carried the main weight of the air war on itself. The napalm strikes were monstrous in their effectiveness. The fiery tanks, dropped from low altitude, wiped entire enemy companies and battalions off the face of the earth. They made nearly impossible any transfer of reinforcements in the daylight hours. By day, the Northerners' roads were raked with fire and burned out. The enemy was forced to hide, to move only under cover of night. The falling star, having descended from the heavens to the earth, had turned into a punishing fiery scourge. It seemed, once again, a triumph. The easy stroll continued, but it ended, suddenly, in a single day. November 8, 1950. This relates to one of the key dates in the entire history of military aviation. On that day, a patrol of 4 flights of American jets cruised the sky over the Yalu River, right at the very border. And there, in the cold autumn sky, they met it for the first time. A machine that should not have existed, an unfamiliar silhouette. A swept wing, not straight like theirs, but angled back, predatory, swift. The Soviet MiG-15. The battle flared up fiercely, and, most importantly, neither side had even the faintest idea of the technical capabilities of its opponent. It was a meeting blind, a duel of 2 strangers. No one knew what the machine across from them was capable of. For 15 minutes in the sky over the Yalu, a furious clash boiled, jet against jet, straight wing against swept, and when it all fell silent, one shooting star crashed to the ground. The Americans, in their turn, also claimed a downed MiG. Such a categorical position from both sides is entirely understandable, for from a historical point of view, this aerial duel of November 8th became truly epical. It was the first battle in the history of mankind in which jet machines participated and were shot down on both sides. The first jet battle, a threshold beyond which a wholly new era of war in the sky began. Whose side to take in the dispute over who shot down whom, let each decide for themselves. But one thing became obvious to all. From now on, in the hands of the opposing sides, there appeared an exceedingly dangerous instrument never seen before, and the American pilots who returned from that battle were grim. They repeated, with one voice, the very same thing. The unfamiliar aircraft with the swept wing possessed a significant superiority in power to weight. It climbed more easily, accelerated more easily, pulled upward better. True, in the horizontal turn, it was somewhat inferior to the shooting star, but that was poor consolation. The balance in the sky had changed, and not in the falling star's favor. Then, worse. On December 27th, another shooting star was shot down in an aerial battle. A week later, 5 aircraft at once failed to return to the airfield. Losses crept upward. The easy stroll had turned into hard, bloody work. But the blackest page in the chronicle of Kelly Johnson's jet firstborn was still ahead. September 12, 1951, a cloudless, clear autumn day, and this peaceful firmament was suddenly pierced by the contrails of nearly 200 aircraft, 200 machines in one sky. 80 swept-wing MiGs clashed in an unprecedented, gigantic aerial brawl with about 100 shooting stars. The air boiled. Tracers traced the sky in every direction. Machines fell, burned, broke apart in the air. And when the smoke cleared, the result of this most intense clash turned out to be terrible. 3 Soviet machines perished, and 15 American ones. 15 falling stars crashed onto Korean soil in a single day. Here, friends, our investigation is obliged to be honest. Around these figures, disputes still boil to this day. English language sources treat such statistics skeptically, contest the loss ratio, and perhaps in some ways they are right. The fog of war distorts any figures. But there is one fact that speaks louder than any reports or dispatches, an indirect but eloquent testimony. Immediately after that day followed the mass withdrawal of the shooting star from the theater of operations. The machine was hastily pulled from the front line of the air war, and yet equipment that successfully beats the enemy and wins in the sky is not withdrawn from the front. On the contrary, it is reinforced. This quiet, unannounced pulling back of the falling star to the rear speaks for itself. far more eloquently than any official statistics. The era of the straight wing was over. Over the Yalu River, the age of swept-wing machines had dawned, and the falling star, which only recently had reigned undividedly in the Korean sky, suddenly turned out to be obsolete, vulnerable, doomed. The zone of fire had received it as a victor and saw it off as the vanquished, not by an enemy of flesh and blood, but by the inexorable march of technical progress itself. But the story of the falling star is not yet over. Ahead lies the sunset, and one wholly unexpected turn that will overturn everything we thought about this machine. In the final phase of our investigation, the black box, we will decode the last entry and deliver the final verdict. So, friends, we have pulled the recorder from the wreckage, we have rewound the tape to the very end, and now, the final entry, the decryption, the finale of our investigation. After that black September day over the Yalu River, the fate of the falling star as a combat fighter was sealed. The era of the straight wing was over. But here is the bitter irony. The machine was not allowed to leave the stage gracefully and at once. There was simply nothing to replace it with. To quickly re-equip the squadrons with the newest swept-wing Thunderjets and Sabres turned out to be impossible. There weren't enough of them. They were only just beginning to be delivered to the troops, and the shooting star remained. Not as a proud aerial fighter, that role had been taken from it, but as a workhorse, as an attack plane. It went on hammering the enemy's positions, carrying napalm and rockets beneath its wings, supporting the ground troops throughout the entire Korean War, right up to its conclusion. It lived out its days. It did the dirty, heavy, thankless work in places where it was no longer fit for aerial duels. The falling star did not go out all at once. Slowly, stubbornly, it burned down over the Korean hills. This relates to the unenviable lot of any machine that has outlived its finest hour. By the time the war ended, only a single group still flew the shooting star, in a National Guard squadron. Of that 300-strong armada that had stood menacingly on the Japanese airfields, a handful remained. But even then, the veterans' service did not end. The machine lingered in the ranks until 1958. And then it was sold off to countries loyal to Washington all over the world. And the longest the falling star shone was in Latin America. In the air forces of a whole number of states in that region, the good old shooting stars carried on serving for many long years. The last of them were stricken from the rolls only in the mid-80s. Think about that. A machine whose first flight took place at the height of the Second World War in 1944 was seeing out its days when the music of the 80s was already playing. 40 years in the sky, an incredible longevity for an aircraft born in such desperate haste. But the main paradox of this story is still ahead. And it is precisely for its sake, friends, that our whole investigation was worth conducting, because the genuine immortality of the falling star came from somewhere no one had expected at all. Back in the 40s, foreseeing the coming boom with sharp foresight, Lockheed decided to act ahead of the curve. The demand for training aircraft in the jet era was inevitably bound to soar sky high, for a whole generation of pilots had to be moved from piston machines onto jets. And the company offered the military a two-seat training variant of its production machine. To fit a place for the second pilot, the instructor, the airframe had to be lengthened by 1 meter. Along the way, the fuselage fuel tank was reduced and the armament limited to just a pair of heavy machine guns. The machine lost its combat ferocity, but gained a new purpose. Flight tests revealed no significant problems, and in 1948, this trainer, under the designation T-33, was recommended for production. And the success, friends, the success surpassed all imaginable expectations, every single one. See for yourself. Of the shooting star fighter, that very combat machine for whose sake everything had been undertaken, 1,700 units were produced. A solid figure, But of the training trainers based on it, there were assembled, attention, 6,500. 6,500 against 1,700. The modest, unarmed offshoot surpassed its formidable combat parent in production by nearly fourfold. The pupil eclipsed the teacher. The shadow turned out to be larger than the one casting it. The T-33 was supplied to the air forces of 36 states around the world. Countless generations of young pilots learned to fly on it, and it left them with the warmest, the brightest memories. An obedient, reliable, forgiving machine. That very temperamental character of the combat firstborn seemed, in the training version, to have been tamed, broken in, and the service life built into this airframe turned out to be truly colossal. And here is the final, the most astonishing stroke in our case. There is a known instance where a single T-33 aircraft, produced in 1959, was sent into well-earned retirement, into pension, only in 2005. Do the math. 46 years in service, 46 years of accident-free, note, accident-free, operation. In that time, the machine spent 11,500 hours in the air. And with that, perhaps, everything has been said. That very capricious, unreliable design, the one that had killed its own pilots, in its peaceful, training guise, turned into a benchmark of durability and dependability. The falling star, which had burned up so swiftly in battle, in the guise of a humble desk for pilots, gained an almost eternal life. And now, having gathered together all the evidence, all the testimony, all the figures, we are ready to deliver the final verdict. Protocol P-80 is closed. The investigation is complete. So what did our historical autopsy reveal? Let us be honest to the very end, as befits an impartial inquiry. Yes, this machine was no flawless genius ahead of its time. That myth we have destroyed, designed within insanely tight deadlines, in the fever of a race to get ahead, it carried within itself, like all its many European competitors, a whole bouquet of the typical errors of its era. The thin metal of the air intakes, torn off on the ground. The capricious, unreliable heart that took lives in testing. The overloaded cockpit trap that destroyed the country's best ace because of a single switch. The absence of an ejection seat, copied from a vanquished enemy. The bitter lag behind the Soviet MiG over Korea. All of this is the truth, recorded in our case in black and white. But, and this is the most important thing, friends, it would be a monstrous injustice to put a full stop there, to close the case with a conviction alone. Because behind all these errors, behind all this terrible price, stood colossal human labor. That very labor of 28 engineers and 100 workers who lived at their workplaces 14 hours a day. The talent of Clarence Kelly Johnson, a man who, out of nothing, by a single telephone call, assembled a team and won an impossible race against time. The perseverance of people who, time and again, changed engines, reworked the fuselage, copied ejection seats, organized demonstration tours, all just to bring their creation to fruition. And this labor, this talent, this perseverance, they were, in the end, rewarded. In defiance of everything, they were transformed into a truly reliable, truly durable, and, there's no denying it, simply a very, very beautiful machine. Into that very falling star whose name thundered over 2 wars, and whose training shadow outlived nearly all its contemporaries. Such is our verdict. The shooting star was neither a flawless idol nor a heap of flying scrap metal. It was an honest reflection of its era, an era that paid in blood for every step into the uncharted jet future, and for all its flaws, for all its terrible price, it remains, beyond any doubt, the most successful jet aircraft of the first generation, not on account of perfection, but on account of the fact that it survived, adapted, and gave the sky tens of thousands of trained pilots. The falling star burned up in the atmosphere of history. But burning, it lit the way for all who flew behind it. With this, our investigation is complete. The recorder is stopped. The tape is wound up. The case of America's first jet firstborn can be closed. But in the archives of history, dozens of other machines await their hour, with their own secrets, their own hidden flaws, and their own unsung feats. And to each of them, we will yet apply our impartial protocol. So, if this examination was of interest to you, don't go far. Leave a like so the inquiry knows. The investigation was worth it. Subscribe to the channel and tap the bell, so as not to miss the next autopsy of a legend. And ahead of us awaits a machine whose story will prove even more unexpected than this one. Friends, thank you for watching. Peace to all, and we'll hear from each other again very soon.